Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Kavat. Take a look at this video of China's Coast Guard being expelled from an exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. It's not video from the Philippines. It was released by Bakamla, Indonesia's maritime security agency. Take a look.
China Coast Guard 5402. This is Indonesian Coast Guard. China Coast Guard 5402. Do you read me?
The incident occurred in the southern reaches of the South China Sea in waters Indonesia calls North Natuna Sea, well within its exclusive economic zone, but also claimed by China. Multiple incidents came in the days after the swearing in of Indonesia's Prime Minister and less than 2 weeks before Subianto Prabowo met Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing. Meanwhile, over in the Taiwan Strait, Beijing sent 4 Coast Guard vessels into restricted waters around Taiwan's outlying islands of Jinmen as China continues its anaconda squeeze of the island democracy. Has China found a new South China Sea target in the government of Subianto Prabowo? And can the Philippines rally South China Sea countries together to stand up to China's territorial expansionism? Joining us today are Aaron Jed Rabena, University of the Philippines Asian Center Professorial Lecturer, and Michael Turton, Taipei Times columnist. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
2 Chinese Coast Guard ships, first the 5302 and then the 5402, entered Indonesia's exclusive economic zone in October northwest of Borneo. In total, they have spent weeks shadowing oil and gas exploration activity carried out by Indonesia's state-owned PT Pertamina. The Indonesian Maritime Security Agency reported that its vessels and a Navy ship expelled the Chinese Coast Guard at least 3 times. The Natuna Sea gas fields are some of the world's largest unexplored gas reserves. To boost exploration in Indonesian untapped areas and meet growing demand, Jakarta plans to offer more than 50 potential onshore and offshore oil and gas blocks over the next 4 years. Michael, let me start with you first. So oil and gas obviously is a big deal for Indonesia, as is sovereign territory. Do you believe that Prabowo will raise the issue of the incursions with Xi Jinping?
I think he will. I think this follows the usual pattern of a leader or an important meeting takes place between the Chinese leader and another country, and just before that, China does some provoking action like this. I think China is Indonesia's #1 trade and #2 investor, and they build a lot of infrastructure in Indonesia. And remember, Indonesia is building a new capital, and they need Chinese investment in that new capital. So I think we're going to see Natuna's raised, but it's not going to be front and center. Right? It's going to be very pro forma, probably on both sides.
Right. Well, you mentioned that it won't be front and center, but you know we've heard that for Prabowo, he's an ex-defense minister, soldier, military general, and he has said that protecting sovereign territory is paramount. Well,
I think a lot of that is aimed at domestic audiences, right? He has promised to double the defense budget from 0.7% of GDP all the way up to 1.5%, which is probably much too small to deal with the kinds of problems they're going to be facing. But their primary relationship with China is economic. China takes nickel and other resources which it needs for its electronic industries. And I think China's going to want to focus it on that, right? And there'll be some, Beijing will simply make its usual blustery claim. It's all ours. It's been ours since, for the last 5,000 years. And Jokowi will be home and go home and tell his people that sovereignty is king and it's ours, and fundamentally nothing's going to change.
I mean, Marcus's experience was different, isn't it? He also chose Beijing as the first overseas visit and had high hopes. And then what happened was basically a swing to the other side. So how instructive do you think it is to look at that experience for Indonesia, or is it a completely different kettle of fish?
I think it's very instructive. I think this new video that they just released, everyone has said they're following now the Philippines program. But it doesn't matter. Philippines has its program, and we still have China encroaching. Vietnam has been fiercely defending its islands. We still have Chinese encroaching. What was it, 2 weeks ago? They beat up some Vietnamese fishermen. whatever every country did, and every country has its own response or it copies the responses of other countries, the Chinese program remains the same.
Aaron, just before Prabowo's inauguration, Jokowi, the previous leader of Indonesia, had a conversation with Xi Jinping. And Xi, in that conversation, said that, well, he expressed the belief that the new Indonesian government would continue its friendly policy toward China. I want you to tell us about Jokowi's approach to the South China Sea. There was a difference between the beginning of his presidency and then towards the end.
Right. So in 2016, there was an incident, and because of China's maritime incursions into the Natunas, so President Jokowi boarded a guided missile frigate. So there was a lot of photo ops, and to show that it is Indonesian waters, that they do not have maritime disputes with China. It is totally theirs. So I think that is one show of Indonesian bravado. And so right now under President Prabowo, they are doing it again. They're exposing again China's actions in the Natunas. But if we will see if this will climb up the escalation ladder, because right now what we're only seeing from China is that there are only intrusions. But in the next weeks or months, will there be water cannonings by China or rammings by China? For example, should Indonesia decide to extract and exploit finally hydrocarbons in that area? So I think that could be a decisive point in China-Indonesia relations.
Michael, you mentioned that they're taking a leaf out of the Philippines playbook. So I assume that you were talking about their transparency strategy.
Yeah.
And so this was actually, it seems to be the first release of video from Bakamla, from the Indonesian side.
Well, I can't remember any other releases, but I expect, as Dr. Rabena does, that this will continue, that China will continue escalating.
Right, okay. Now, meanwhile, in the Taiwan Strait, on October 28th and 29th, China sent 4 Coast Guard vessels into Taiwan's restricted waters around Jinmen's Fuxing Island, Taishan, Liaoluo and Beijing. They were eventually expelled by Taiwan's Coast Guard. This was released by Taiwan's Coast Guard. Take a look.
中国海警14603，中国海警14603，这是中华民国海医署一批亚东龙属拐山艇。 离船已进入中华民国禁限制水域，严重破坏区域和平稳定，影响海上航行安全及交通秩序，请立即转向航离。
Michael, let me come back to you. So Chinese Coast Guard vessels have entered apparently Jinmen and Matsu waters a total of 48 times this year. What do you see is happening here?
I think we're going to see the same steady escalation. A lot of people watching this feel that the next step is going to be starting to arrest Taiwanese fishermen for being in Chinese waters, right? Because the Chinese don't really accept that is Taiwan, that Taiwan has anything like sovereignty there. So I think we're going to see gray zoning sort of slide into lawfare at some point, and that's where this is headed.
Right. And Aaron, to what extent do you think Taiwan is being influenced by the Philippines' assertive transparency?
Yeah, I think a lot because both are, in a sense, in the same boat. So I think the parallelisms are quite evident. So with this, I think these governments are trying to communicate not just with their own domestic audiences, but also with the international community as well, with expositions and maritime challenges like these. And this year, the Philippines and Indonesia celebrate 75 years of formal diplomatic relations. In September, Prabowo visited Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in Manila to discuss bolstering their ties. Then President-elect Prabowo said Indonesia considers the Philippines a strategic partner, particularly in the defense sector. He told Marcos, "I'm very impressed by your leadership. Your strategic insights have significantly advanced the Philippines' position on the global stage while showing real progress in politics, economy, and military." Earlier in June, their navies held a joint patrol in the waters of Sulawesi and Mindanao to enhance interoperability between their forces. Michael, how closely do you expect the Philippines and Indonesia to continue to work together in this respect? I mean, it sounds like, with him saying, "I really respect your leadership, Marcos,"
You've carved out a position on the global stage. Is that something that he wants for Indonesia?
I think so. And remember, as he rises on the global stage, he also rises on the domestic stage. So he's playing to both audiences.
And Aaron, how significant do you think it is? I mean, we obviously heard of the Philippines. Vietnam has been vocal at some points as well, though not as much. And then now we have a new leader for for Indonesia, and we have seen publicity given to the incidents after Prabowo's inauguration. Do you see it as another ASEAN member being drawn in to the clashes in the South China Sea?
Right. So I think what Indonesia could do now is to align with the Philippines, push for the fast tracking of the code of conduct in the South China Sea. So I think this could be an incentive for Indonesia to support the Philippines more, and also also Vietnam, in finally expediting the COC process.
But the thing that's standing in the way of that progressing is China, isn't it? It's not the Philippines.
Yeah. So, but if you have a collective voice, that sticks together and tries to hammer out a consensus, I think it could be much faster, more powerful than just one country going it alone.
Michael, do you agree with that? I mean, you said at the beginning of the show, it doesn't matter what the Philippines does, Vietnam does, China has its program, it will just continue doing that. But do you so agree with Aaron that actually coming together as a coalition might actually move the needle?
I'm quite pessimistic. I mean, it's not just the South China Sea we're looking at. Last week, Palau was complaining about China pressure on it. It swallowed 12% of Bhutan. It's all around China's periphery. And so in order for there to really be action, one of the major powers would have to come in to back it, like Japan or the US. With Indonesia, they look at China, but they also have one eye on the US and also Australia, which is very important to them. And I think the Aussies have underestimated how soon China's going to be arriving on their doorstep. So until they bring in one of the major powers, they're going to struggle to get anything done.
Let me ask you then about the cooperation between the Philippines and Vietnam. They have signed security, Coast Guard agreements, and in August this year they held the first Coast Guard drills. Do you think that sort of activity could make any difference?
I think it's wonderful that this is happening. But as long as they have overlapping and sometimes conflicting territorial claims, China will always have a lever that it can use to keep these coalitions from becoming very close. So, and everyone has to cooperate, and we've already seen how Malaysia has been reluctant to jump in here with the other countries that are pushing back against China.
And so how do you see Indonesia? Do you see that it is much more willing than Malaysia to do
I think so too, and I think inevitably as it stays economically close to China, it will move strategically and diplomatically closer to the United States as to balance this. Because
Indonesia?
Indonesia. It's the inevitable result of Chinese pressure, I think.
Aaron, one final one on this one. Just going back to the ASEAN issue, is China what some analysts call depleting its regional strategic capital? I mean, all of this sort of assertiveness, if we can call it that, in terms of its territorial claims, all of the exposure by the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia, is there a cost on China for doing that?
I think, so that is, I think, one dimension of looking at it, because why is China doing this, right? All at the same time with Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, or Taiwan. And at the same time, I think it would also be...
Well, we know why it's doing it, because it believes that these countries rely on China for their economy.
Right.
So, okay.
Exactly. So that's another dimension that's worth looking into, if whether or not it is indeed really costing China. If in the economic indicators show that they still are trading, for example, they're still having engagements or other opportunities with China, then perhaps that means they're mixed signals. Okay, so China is both seen as an opportunity and a threat, a challenge, that ASEAN countries and ASEAN member states are trying to strike a balance with. Yeah, so it's a delicate balancing act for each ASEAN member state. So for the Philippines, for example, there is more articulation, voicing of opposition or displeasure with China's claims. But that isn't necessarily the case in the case of Malaysia. There are different national interests for the claimants.
So do you believe that the more claimants that do step forward, do stand up to China, that there would be a cost, that they would impose that cost on China? You know, do the numbers become a force multiplier?
Yeah, they can. Yeah, like I said, in the code of conduct, because geographically speaking, for example, the Natunas, they are far from the Paracel Islands, and these islands are also far from Scarborough Shoal and the Second Thomas Shoal. So it is quite, in terms of joint patrols, for example, where should one conduct the joint patrols? But in terms of information sharing, like I said, the lobbying of the code of conduct, these are areas where all these ASEAN claimant states or relevant countries can come together and converge.
Okay, Michael, in a recent International Institute for Strategic Studies article, one regional security analyst said that Manila was responsible for a diplomatic decoupling from China and even from fellow ASEAN states. You know, in your opinion, is there evidence that Manila has been, you know, attempting to decouple diplomatically from China?
I haven't seen any, and when you think about how much the huge role that China plays in the Philippines economy, for example, the State Grid Corporation of China owns 40% of the Philippines grid, right? The Visayas connector, which is an electric cable that runs between the islands and the Philippines, was put in by Chinese companies. And everywhere you go, all throughout Philippines, the local shops, they're full of Chinese goods, right? Some of them are owned by Chinese. You visit the shop. I've spoken Chinese with shop owners sitting in front of their shops. So you see that on one hand, there's this level of diplomatic level where everyone is concerned about Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. But it doesn't seem to come home to China in any other way, as Dr. Rabena was saying a few minutes ago. So I don't see evidence that Manila is decoupled from China, and certainly not from any of the countries around it.
Aaron, can you shed any light on this analyst's article? I mean, is he perhaps coming to that conclusion simply because the Philippines does have the assertive transparency strategy, which seems to be more confrontational?
Right. I think it's important to note that the Philippines, recently entered into a provisional agreement with China in Second Thomas Shoal, and that is a product of the 9th bilateral consultation mechanism. So under President Marcos, we've already held 3, the 7th, 8th, and 9th BCM. So there is, diplomacy is still works.
Yeah,
okay?
It's ongoing.
Is ongoing. And last year, President Marcos met with President Xi on the sidelines of the APEC meeting, APEC summit. And also last year, our Foreign Affairs Secretary spoke to Wang Yi on the phone. So diplomatically, both sides continue to talk.
Right, yeah. Okay. Michael, Taiwan often finds itself in a similar position. It's blamed for not talking to China. Can you explain why is this so? And are there any comparisons with the Philippines?
Well, the Philippines is a sovereign nation whose sovereignty is widely accepted. But for Taiwan, China insists as a precondition of talks that Taiwan accept that it's part of China. And of course, we can't do that here. So the Taiwan situation is somewhat different from the Philippines situation in that.
Right, okay. And how would you assess Prabowo-Xi diplomacy so far? There was a meeting in April. That was after he won the election but wasn't yet president. That was at the invitation of Xi Jinping. And then now, the first state visit by him to visit Xi Jinping.
Well, it's that China remains a major player in the Indonesian economy, and as long as that is the case, they will continue speaking to each other and visiting each other in this way.
Okay. A report released by the International Crisis Group on October 10th has identified potential conflict areas across the globe within the next 6 months. The report said the Philippines could attempt to build permanent structures on Second Thomas Shoal, which could prompt Beijing to respond, potentially leading to conflict. Now, Manila maintains a small contingent of soldiers on a grounded World War II ship called the Sierra Madre to assert its sovereignty of the shoal, which lies within its exclusive economic zone. Aaron, what evidence is there that Manila is trying to build anything there other than perhaps to reinforce the Sierra Madre?
So there are talks right now of the Philippines, right? Should the Philippines have a stronger presence in Second Thomas Shoal? Because that ship will one day inevitably, experts say, collapse. So what will the Philippines do then if that day comes and then happens? So that's why some are suggesting that should there be a stronger structure, formed over there.
But is that at the government level?
I think
that analysts.
So the government, just like I said, just entered into a provisional agreement with China. And in that agreement, China opposes the delivery or transportation of large-scale construction materials. So the likely response of China is perhaps if there'll be more to that is, they'll object again and intercept again Philippine attempts to do so.
In my conversation with Jed Rabena, who's a Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson, he was very, very firm on this, and he said that this is Marcos's position, that they would not alter the status quo. So that's why I wanted to distinguish with you, who is it that is talking about building a more permanent structure, whether it's government, Philippine government, or simply commenting?
From the government, not that I know of.
Right.
Perhaps it's from the public that have suggested to the government that there be stronger structures in place.
Okay. So, Michael, we know that for Indonesia's military, it has bases on the or close to the Natuna Islands. And of course, these have come about because of China's, claims to the 9- or 10- line. So I wanted to ask you, now Beijing is, as we saw with the Philippines, very firm itself on that there mustn't be any island building, any construction of any sorts. And yet this is what China has done. It has built several and militarized these islands in the South China Sea. It's also acting very aggressively with violence, knives and axes, that its so-called law enforcement officials have used against the Philippines and Vietnam, as you mentioned earlier. So can Beijing have it both ways? Can it do all that itself and then also prevent other countries from trying to build more permanent bases?
Well, I think we've seen with Vietnam at least that it can't do that. If Vietnam is building islands and it's reinforcing and militarizing them, and in fact, it's been doing that for years. And so what it comes down to is what can each nation do? What can it support in that area against China? And so far, the hidden or absent actor here is Washington, right? Philippines has a security treaty with the United States, and so the United States talks to Manila all the time. Please, don't provoke them. It's a constraint on what Philippines can do, the relationship with the United States in some ways. And Vietnam doesn't have that constraint, and neither does Indonesia.
Some would argue that it's that backing that actually enables the Philippines to be more assertive.
Well, I wouldn't argue that. It may make the Philippines feel that way, but the U.S. It's been said repeatedly that the U.S. has been very worried about what could happen there, even as the U.S. publicly says, this is all covered by the treaty with the Philippines, and if someone is killed, we will intervene.
Aaron, so finally, let's get back to the meeting between Xi Jinping and Subianto Prabowo. In your view, do you think Xi will succeed? He obviously wants Prabowo to be another Jokowi. To what extent will he succeed, do you think?
Well, certainly, because Indonesia is ASEAN's largest economy. So Indonesia is also like the de facto leader of ASEAN. So China would certainly want to see to it that the momentum, just as they had with Jokowi, will remain. And of course, after this meeting between them, we'll see if there'll be less
What's your
incidents.
personal view, though? That's what I'm asking.
Yes, it
Based
depends
on
also on what China will do in the Natunas,
Right.
and if Indonesia will continue to expose it.
China will continue doing what it's doing. That's probably
Right.
not a variable.
Right. So I think each government has there's nuances in terms of their threat perceptions and assessments of China. So let's see if there will be more parallelism. Yeah.
Okay. Michael, your view on that?
I think it'll be irresistible to keep it out in the open because there's a strong domestic response, right? Whenever leaders become more nationalistic, the public responds. You've already seen in Philippines, wasn't there a recent poll showing that 70 or 80% of the public would not support a pro-China presidential candidate? Marcos has to be reading those polls, right? So I think we're going to see the same pattern simply because of domestic pressures on the Indonesian government.
Right. And just to get a final analysis from you, so how the past of Prabowo, we said that he's an ex-defense minister, an ex-general. How much does that shape how he reacts in the South China Sea?
That's an interesting question. Right? Everyone who has a hammer thinks all their problems are nails. So it's kind of worrisome that way. But also, at least he knows, and the military trusts, I don't know, the military knows him and he knows the military, and that's really important.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Jed Rabena and Michael Turton, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.